Chapter 1. The Echo of Silence. The house had a sound, and the sound was silence. Not the peaceful, deep-breathing silence of a sleeping home, but the thin, stretched silence of a held breath. It was the sound of things left unsaid, of footsteps that were too light, of doors that were closed too carefully. For 10-year-old Leo, this silence was the background score to his life, a constant hum beneath the floorboards of his existence. It had been 734 days since the other silence, the one that had followed the ringing phone and his Aunt Carol's choked gasp. That silence had been a void, a black hole that had swallowed his world whole. His parents, a brilliant, smiling pair who smelled of sawdust and lavender, were a photograph on his nightstand now. They were a story that ended abruptly mid-sentence. The car accident, the police report, the funeral, those were just words people used to paper over the gaping hole they had left behind. Now, Leo lived here, in his aunt's house, a place that never quite felt like home. It was a house of beige walls and beige carpets, a house that seemed to have been deliberately scrubbed of any vibrant color. He slept in the room that used to be a storage closet, a space so small that when he stretched his arms out, his fingertips could brush both walls. It was his, at least. A small, rectangular world he could control. Taged world. Outside that room was far less controllable. It was dominated by his cousins, Mark and Josh. Mark, at 13, was a creature of brute force and simple desires. He was built like a small refrigerator, and his presence filled every room he entered. Josh, a year younger than Mark, was wiry and quick, his cruelty more refined. He was the strategist, the one whose whispers could inflict more damage than Mark's shoves. They saw Leo as an intruder, a glitch in their system. He was the quiet, strange boy who didn't belong. Their torment was a daily ritual, as predictable as the sunrise. It was the accidental trip in the hallway, the stolen dessert from his dinner plate, the constant barrage of names: orphan, weirdo, freak. Leo learned early on that tears were a currency they traded in, and he refused to make them rich. His response was to retreat, to build a fortress inside himself where they couldn't reach. The bricks of this fortress were numbers. His father had been a carpenter, but his passion was mathematics. He had shelves of old cloth-bound books with titles like An Introduction to the Theory of Numbers and Elements of Abstract Algebra. To Aunt Carol, they were just dust collectors. To Leo, they were scripture. His father had taught him to see the world in patterns, to find the elegant logic hidden beneath the chaos. Everything has a system, Leo, he used to say, his voice a warm rumble. You just have to find the variables. Leo would spend hours at the small desk in his room, the smell of old paper a comforting ghost. He wasn't just doing homework, he was communing with his father. He traced the elegant curves of integral symbols, felt the satisfying click of a perfectly balanced equation, and found a profound peace in the absolute certainty of a correct answer. In a world of shifting allegiances and unspoken rules, 2 + 2 would always, unequivocally, equal 4. It was the only truth he could hold on to. This evening, the silence in the house was particularly loud. Aunt Carol was working a double shift at the diner, a common occurrence. Her absence was an invitation for Mark and Josh to amplify their campaign. Leo could hear them in the living room, the sound of a violent video game punctuated by their jeering laughter. He had a sheet of algebra problems in front of him, 100 equations that needed to be solved for X. He loved it. Each problem was a small, contained universe, and he was its master. He was on question 87, his pencil flying across the page, when his door creaked open. He didn't look up. Looking up was a concession. "Look at him," Josh's voice sneered from the doorway, "trying to be a genius." Leo kept his eyes fixed on the paper. 7x 14 equals 21. Add 14 to both sides. 7x equals 35. Divide by 7, x equals 5. Beautiful. A heavy shadow fell over his desk. Mark was breathing over his shoulder, a sour smell of chips and soda on his breath. "What you're doing, orphan, your nerd homework." Leo carefully wrote x equals 5 in the answer blank and moved to question 88. "He's ignoring us," Josh said, his voice closer now. He entered the room and leaned against the desk, his hip bumping a neat stack of completed worksheets. They slid, fanning out across the floor. Leo's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He just stared at the next equation. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Mark grunted, poking Leo's shoulder with a thick finger. "With your books and your good grades. Mom is always saying, 'Why can't you be more like Leo?'" He said the last part in a high, mocking imitation of his mother's voice. That was the heart of it, Leo knew. The variable he couldn't control. His quiet success in school was a mirror that reflected their own failures, and they hated him for it. Josh picked up the top sheet from the floor. "Wow, look at all these little numbers. So neat, so perfect." His voice was laced with a false sweetness that was more menacing than Mark's open aggression. Before Leo could react, Josh ripped the paper in half. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Then he ripped it again, and again. The small, neat numbers were reduced to confetti. Something inside Leo snapped. Not with a bang, but with a cold, quiet click. He slowly raised his head, his gray eyes, usually so distant, now laser-focused. He looked at the pieces of his hard work scattered on the floor, then at Josh's triumphant smirk. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up, his movements deliberate. He walked past them, out of his room, and into the kitchen. He could feel their confused, expectant eyes on his back. They were waiting for the explosion, for the tears, for the fight. They were waiting for him to play his part in their game. Leo opened the pantry, took out the large, economy-sized box of oatmeal, and walked back to his room. Mark and Josh were still standing there, looking bewildered. Leo walked over to his desk, where his school backpack lay open. He looked them both in the eye, his expression unreadable, and then he calmly, methodically, upended the entire box of oatmeal into his own backpack, burying his textbooks, his pencils, and his remaining homework under a mountain of dry, dusty flakes. He zipped the bag shut, a fine powder puffing into the air. Mark stared, his mouth agape. "What are you doing? You're crazy." Josh's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. You just ruined your own stuff." Leo slung the heavy, oat-filled backpack over his shoulder. He looked at the torn pieces of his homework on the floor, then back at them. He still hadn't said a word. He walked out of the room, leaving them standing in the middle of his tiny space, the victors of a battle they no longer understood. Downstairs, he sat at the kitchen table and waited for his aunt to come home. He had solved the equation. They wanted to cause him pain by destroying his work. He had negated their action by doing it himself, but in a way that made no sense. He had introduced an irrational number into their simple, brutal algebra. He had taken away their power by taking away their predictable outcome. He didn't know what would happen next, but as he sat there in the humming silence, he felt a strange, cold sense of victory. He had changed the variable. Chapter 2. The Geometry of a Bully. Aunt Carol came home a little after 11, her face etched with the exhaustion that seemed to be her permanent expression. She moved like a woman wading through deep water, every step an effort. She dropped her keys and purse on the counter with a clatter that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet house. "Leo, what are you doing up?" she asked, her voice raspy. She saw him at the table, his backpack sitting on the floor beside him, and her shoulders slumped a little further. "Is everything okay, Q?" It was always her first question, and it always felt like she was hoping for the answer to be yes, so she wouldn't have to deal with it if it was no. "My homework got ruined," Leo said, his voice flat and even. Aunt Carol sighed, a long, weary sound. She opened the fridge and stared inside, as if hoping to find an answer in there, next to the milk. "How? Did you spill something on it?" "Something like that," Leo said. At that moment, Mark and Josh clattered down the stairs, drawn by the sound of their mother's return. They were hoping to get their version of the story in first. "Mom, you won't believe what he did." Mark started immediately. He went totally crazy. He dumped a whole box of oatmeal in his own backpack. Aunt Carol turned, her brow furrowed in confusion. She looked from her son's eager, accusing faces to Leo's calm, impassive one. "Oatmeal, Leo, is that true?" "Yes," Leo said. "Why on earth would you do that?" Leo looked at his cousins. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They had expected him to tattle, to whine, to accuse. They were prepared for that fight. They were not prepared for this. "They ripped up my math homework," Leo stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "I figured I might as well finish the job." Aunt Carol's gaze swung to her sons. Josh immediately put on an expression of wounded innocence. "We did not. He's lying. We were just playing, and he started acting weird." "He's a freak, Mom," Mark added. Aunt Carol looked back at Leo, her eyes pleading. She was tired. She didn't want a complex problem. She wanted a simple solution. The easiest solution was that Leo, the strange, quiet boy, was the problem. "Leo, are you sure they ripped it? Maybe it was an accident." "They tore it into little pieces," Leo said, his voice unwavering. "Then they threw it on the floor." "We didn't," Josh insisted. It was their word against his. 2 against 1. The odds were not in his favor. Leo knew this. He had calculated it. "Boys, go up to bed," Aunt Carol said, her voice strained. They scurried away, but not before shooting triumphant glances at Leo. They had won. Aunt Carol sank into a chair opposite Leo. She rubbed her temples, a gesture he knew well. "Leo, I know it's difficult here, but you can't just destroy your things out of anger. That backpack, those books, they cost money." "I know," Leo said. He had factored that in. "And lying about your cousins isn't going to help anything." "I'm not lying, Leo." Her voice was sharp now. "Enough. I'm too tired for this. Clean out your bag. I'll write a note to your teacher. Just ... try to get along, for me please." Cut. She didn't wait for an answer. She pushed herself up from the table and trudged up the stairs, the weight of her life heavy on her shoulders. Leo was left alone in the kitchen's sterile light. He had lost. In the eyes of the only authority in this house, he was the liar, the problem child, but as he hoisted the heavy backpack and took it to the trash can in the garage, he didn't feel defeated. He felt a strange sense of clarity. He had learned something vital. Direct confrontation was a zero-sum game. Their word against his would always leave him at a disadvantage. He couldn't win by playing their game, so he would have to play his own. The next day at school, Leo handed the note from his aunt to his math teacher, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson was a portly man with a kind smile who appreciated Leo's quiet dedication. He read the note with a frown. "An accident with breakfast, huh?" he said, peering at Leo over his glasses. "That's a shame. This was a graded assignment, Leo, a big one." "I know, sir," Leo said. "I can redo it. You'll have to. I'll give you until tomorrow, but I'll have to dock you 10% for being late. Rules are rules." "I understand," Leo said. He spent his lunch period and a study hall in the library, meticulously resolving all 100 equations. It was easier the second time. He finished before the final bell rang. When he got home, Mark and Josh were in the backyard, throwing a football. They smirked at him as he walked past, the confident smirks of victors. Leo ignored them, went to his room, and placed his freshly completed homework in his now oat-free backpack. Then he began the second phase of his plan. He knew his cousins' routines. He knew their weaknesses. Josh, for all his cunning, was lazy. His history project, a diorama of the Battle of Gettysburg, was due in 2 days. He had barely started it, and it was sitting on his desk, a chaotic mess of glue, cardboard, and unpainted plastic soldiers. Mark's weakness was his prized possession, a brand-new, autographed jersey from his favorite football player, which he planned to wear to school on Friday. Leo waited until they were asleep. The house was finally filled with the right kind of silence. He crept into Josh's room first. The diorama was a disaster. Leo didn't destroy it. Destruction was their method, not his. He simply made a few, precise adjustments. He took the tiny plastic figure of Abraham Lincoln and, with a tiny drop of superglue, affixed him to the top of the Confederate cannon. He then took the Union general and glued his feet firmly in the middle of the Confederate camp, facing the wrong way. Finally, he swapped the meticulously handwritten labels for Union forces and Confederate Army. It was subtle. It was sabotage, not vandalism. Next, he went to Mark's room. The jersey was lying on a chair. Leo took a black fine-tipped marker. He didn't draw on the front. He turned it over. On the back, just below the player's name, was a large, blank space. In small, neat, almost invisible letters, Leo wrote a single equation: 6 by 3, plus 2 by 5, 18 equals 10. It was a perfectly correct, perfectly balanced equation. And the answer, 10, was the jersey number of the star player from their school's biggest rival team. He went back to his room and slept more soundly than he had in months. The fallout was glorious, and he got to watch it all from a safe, analytical distance. Josh didn't notice the changes to his diorama until he was standing in front of his history class the next day. The teacher, a stickler for historical accuracy, stopped him mid-presentation. The ensuing confusion, Josh's frantic attempts to unglue Abraham Lincoln from the cannon, and the quiet snickers from his classmates resulted in a failing grade and a week's detention for presenting a mockery of a pivotal moment in American history. Mark's humiliation was more public. He wore the jersey on Friday, strutting through the school halls. It wasn't until lunchtime that someone from the rival school pointed it out. The accusation that he was a secret fan of their enemy spread like wildfire. Mark, who was not equipped for intellectual combat, could only respond with sputtering rage, which only made him look more guilty. He spent the rest of the day as a social pariah. When they got home, their fury was immense. But they couldn't prove a thing. There were no witnesses. There was no confession. There was only Leo, sitting quietly in his room, reading a book on trigonometry. When they tried to complain to their mother, their accusations sounded insane. He glued Lincoln to a cannon. He wrote a math problem on my jersey. Aunt Carol, already at her wit's end, just threw her hands up. Leave your cousin alone and go to your rooms. I swear, you boys are going to be the death of me. They were punished for their bad grades and bad attitudes. Leo was left in peace. He had not laid a hand on them. He had not raised his voice. He had simply used their own world against them, applying a precise, calculated amount of force to the exact right pressure point. It was a beautiful, elegant proof, and in the quiet sanctuary of his room, Leo smiled.